Hello and welcome to African Elements and the first of a series on Black politics. I'm Darius Spearman. In this episode, what is politics and what defines the experience of Black folks within political structures? How does racism factor into that experience? Finally, how do the different ways in which we define freedom impact the political experience of Black folks at large? All that coming up next. We begin our series with the basics. What is politics? For the purpose of this web series, politics refers to the shaping and distribution of power. The most commonly referred to means of shaping and distributing power is the simple act of deciding what individuals will have the ability to set policies and represent a specific group of constituents. Or more simply, the act of voting. But while I don't mean to downplay the importance of voting, politics is so much more than that. How you dress, how you wear your hair, where you shop, where you don't shop. All of these things, if done for the purpose of shaping and distributing power, can be political acts. If you use your imagination, anything, even a prank, can be a means of political activism.
Here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report, I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, one of the country's favorite anti-corporate pranksters and gonzo political activists, the Yes Men, are back. This time with a new film called The Yes Men Fix the World. An official selection at this year's Sundance Film Festival. The documentary debuts on HBO on Monday. The Yes Men Fix the World follows Andy Bickelbaum and Mike Bonanno as they infiltrate and expose the world of big business through high-profile, outrageous pranks. From ExxonMobil to Halliburton, no industry is too big for the Yes Men's hoaxes. The film opens with one of the Yes Men's most audacious pranks, impersonating a Dow Chemicals spokesperson on BBC World News in a 2004 broadcast that reached 300 million people. Andy Bickelbaum, who identified himself as Jude Finisterra and claimed to represent Dow Chemical, took responsibility for the world's largest industrial accident, which took place in 1984 in the central Indian city of Bhopal.
Joining us live from Paris now is Jude Finisterra. He's a spokesman for Dow Chemicals, which took over Union Carbide. Good morning to you. A day of commemoration in Bhopal. Do you now accept responsibility for what happened?
Steve, yes. Today is a great day for all of us at Dow, and I think for millions of people around the world as well. It's 20 years since the disaster, and today I'm very, very happy to announce that for the first time, Dow is accepting full responsibility for the Bhopal catastrophe. We have a $12 billion plan to finally, at long last, fully compensate the victims, including the 120,000 who may need medical care for their entire lives, and to fully and swiftly remediate the Bhopal plant site. Now, when we acquired Union Carbide 3 years ago, we knew what we were getting, and it's worth $12 billion. $12 billion. We have resolved to liquidate Union Carbide, this nightmare for the world and this headache for Dow, and use the $12 billion to provide more than $500 per victim, which is all that they've seen, a maximum of just about $500 per victim. It is not plenty good for an Indian, as one of our spokespersons unfortunately said a couple of years ago. In fact, it pays for 1 year of medical care. We will adequately compensate the victims. Furthermore, we will perform a full and complete remediation of the Bhopal site, which, as you mentioned, has not been cleaned up. When Union Carbide abandoned the site 20 years ago, or 16 years ago, they left tons of toxic waste, which the site continues to be used as a playground by children. Water continues to be drunk from the groundwater underneath. It's a mess, Steve. And
it's a mess, certainly, Jude. That's good news that you have finally accepted responsibility. Some people would say too late. It's 3 years,
yes.
Almost 4 years on. How soon is your money going to make a difference to the people in Bhopal?
Well, as soon as we can get it to them, Steve. We've begun the process of liquidating Union Carbide. This is, as you mentioned, late, but it's the only thing we can do. When we acquired Union Carbide, we did settle their liabilities in the United States immediately. And we are now, 3 years later, prepared to do the same in India. We should have done it 3 years ago. We are doing it now. I would say that it's better late than never. And I would also like to say that this is no small matter, Steve. This is the first time in history that a publicly owned company of anything near the size of Dow has performed an action which is significantly against its bottom line simply because it's the right thing to do. And our shareholders may take a bit of a hit, Steve, but I think that if they're anything like me, they will be ecstatic to be part of such a historic occasion of doing right by those that we've wronged.
The hoax ran twice on BBC World and was picked up by the major news wires before the BBC determined that no man named Jude Finisterra worked at Dow and that he was an imposter. The action caused Dow's market value to drop $2 billion in less than a half hour. Later that day, Dow corrected the apology that their supposed spokesperson had made.
This morning, a false statement was carried by BBC World regarding responsibility for the Bhopal tragedy. The individual who made this statement identified himself as a Dow spokesperson named Jude Finisterra. Dow confirms that there was no basis whatsoever for this report. And we also confirm that Jude Finisterra is neither an employee nor a spokesperson for Dow.
Well, that action was from over 5 years ago, and it brought the ongoing tragedy in Bhopal back in the spotlight, reminding the world of Dow Chemical's responsibility to those who survived the catastrophic gas leak. This year marks the 25th anniversary of the Bhopal disaster, which has killed over 25,000 people, but Dow Chemical has still not been held accountable. We'll get to more on Bhopal in a minute, but right now we're joined in our Firehouse studio by the Yes Men, Andy Bickelbaum and Mike Bonanno. We welcome you to Democracy Now! The film will be airing that you made on HBO on Monday night on July 27th, which includes the story. Now, Andy, Jude Finisterra, first, how did you come up with that name when you were walking into the Paris studio of Jude Finisterra?
Well, Jude is the patron saint of the impossible, and there's absolutely no way a company like Dow will ever do the right thing in Bhopal unless we force it. And Finisterra, of course, end of the world, end of the earth. It's just never going to happen. Explain your website, Guerrilla Tactics, how even BBC got in touch with you. Well, in this, sometimes we sneak our way into things more actively. In this case, we just had this website, dowethics.com, that looked just like the real Dow Chemical website. We had launched it a couple of years earlier, gotten a little press around it, gotten it kind of seeded in Google, and then suddenly, a week before the 20th anniversary of the Bhopal catastrophe, the BBC stumbled on the site.
And they invited you through the site.
Yeah.
So they contacted you?
Yep.
So if politics is the process of shaping and distributing power, then what is power? The most common political definition of power is simply the ability to get a person or group of people to do something that that person or group otherwise would not do. For those of you who are viewing this series as part of a course requirement, for example, if you would not otherwise be viewing this video, then your instructor is exercising a certain degree of power. That power is based on your desire to fulfill some requirement or pass a test that the instructor has control over. In turn, you as students collectively hold a certain degree of power. If your instructor is not performing adequately, you can exercise your power to get your instructor to change his or her behavior by lodging a complaint with the department chair or dean. If you understand the way in which political systems work, then the variety of ways in which you can exercise power are bound only by your creativity. This web series is aimed at just that, understanding how political systems work so that you can best decide what methods you will use in order to harness your power and affect the change that you would like to see in the world. One of the main features of the political system that we will be exploring is anti-black politics, which systematically limits the degree to which black folks can exercise power. In other words, a major component in the shaping and distribution of power as it relates to black people is racism. For the purpose of this series, racism will be defined as the intentional or unintentional predication of decisions and policies that has the impact of subordinating a particular racial group and maintaining control over it. Notice here that the definition of racism that we will be operating under does not require the subordination of the group to be intentional, nor does it require that the subordination be an act of malice. Racism in a political sense goes far beyond what we typically view as racist groups such as the Ku Klux Klan or neo-Nazis. The definition we will be using also doesn't necessarily concern itself with the actions of individuals. For example, a poor white person screaming a racial epithet at me has little or no ability to influence my behavior or get me to do something that I otherwise would not do, which is to simply go on about my day. Such an individual, therefore, has little or no power over me. One does not have to be a member of a hate group or hurl a racial epithet in order to engage in anti-black politics. In fact, many anti-black policies come from people who think themselves liberal, fair-minded folk, who would be the first to say that they abhor hate groups such as the Ku Klux Klan and readily condemn them. And I believe them. Consider, for example, college admissions and the politics which determines whether or not you have the ability to attend the university of your choice. The political discourse over the past generation has centered around the notion of merit. But who decides who is deserving of admission and who lacks merit? More importantly, who decides what constitutes merit? Those who push SAT and GPA scores, for example, believe that these are objective measures of merit and that minimizing these measures would give an unfair and unearned advantage to minority students, a notion often referred to as reverse racism. The perception of a meritocracy remains, even though it has been demonstrated repeatedly, for example, that the SAT test is a better predictor of family income than it is of success of first-year students in college. Other measures of merit, such as personal narratives, give a better overall picture of the student and what he or she brings to the academic community. Such measures are often looked at as non-meritocratic, even though repeated studies have shown that there is value in having a diverse range of experiences that students bring to bear in the academic community. Similarly, GPA scores carry many of the same racial biases. The use of honors classes and the extra weight given of 5 points on a 4-point scale means that students in schools that offer such classes gain an advantage. Coincidentally, those schools happen to be in more wealthy districts. A report issued by the Harvard Civil Rights Project observed that school integration was at the same level in 2004 as it was in 1969. Thus, African Americans who are still segregated in less wealthy districts are being penalized simply because their schools don't offer them the opportunity to gain extra grade points. As a result, African American students who might have a 4.0 grade point average might be competing with students from other districts who have a 4.1, 4.2, 4.3 grade point average on a 4-point scale. As we will see, who controls the narrative, or who has the ability to determine what constitutes merit and what doesn't constitute merit, has the ability to exercise a great deal of power. So, it's important here to note that when I speak of racism, I'm not necessarily talking about individuals wearing white sheets and hoods. I'm speaking of individuals and institutions that put in place policies that have the impact of subordinating a particular racial group regardless of the intention. Thus, Black politics is the purposeful activity of Black people to acquire, use, and maintain power, whereas the policies and laws of anti-Black politics revolve around maintaining dominant structures and institutions of white privilege, regardless of intention. So, what is to prevent Black people as a collective group from exercising power? In order to exercise power, one must first have a degree of freedom or rights. Oftentimes these terms are used interchangeably. Also complicating matters is that there is no universally agreed on definition as to what freedom means. How we define freedom, however, is critically important to defining the limits of our individual power or ability to get a person to do something that they otherwise would not have done. Do I have the freedom, for example, to determine where I live, what school I'm able to attend, where I'm able to work, whether that work will provide me a living wage? Conversely, if I have these freedoms, then do I also have the freedom to determine certain people are not allowed to live in my community, are not allowed to attend schools with my children, or are not entitled to a wage that I deem appropriate for myself? Whether or not I have these freedoms depends on how one defines freedom. This may seem basic, but historically African Americans and the white power structure that they exist within have differed in fundamental ways on the definition of freedom and the limits of freedom. How is it possible, for example, that so many of those clamoring for freedom from British rule in 1776 were slaveholders themselves? Thomas Paine excoriated the elite American colonists in his revolutionary pamphlet, Common Sense, in which he angrily asked with what consistency or decency they complain so loudly of attempts to enslave them while they hold so many hundreds of thousands in slavery. Preach, Thomas. How is it possible that Thomas Jefferson, laying out his argument for the liberation of British rule, could assert with a straight face that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Was it Jefferson's intention that these inalienable rights he spoke of be extended to the hundreds of slaves that he owned? The disconnect here goes far beyond simple hypocrisy and points to the fundamental ways in which the framers of the Constitution defined freedom differently from those who were left out of the process: African Americans, Native Americans, women, and non-property owning poor whites. To better understand the definition of freedom that Jefferson was operating under, we have to look a few generations earlier at the writings of one of the major Enlightenment figures. The Enlightenment was a period of time in which people were questioning the relationship between God, man, and the universe. It was a time in which technological breakthroughs allowed for the masses of people to better understand their place in the universe and begin to question, for example, whether the sun, the moon, and the planets are set in motion by God, or perhaps other forces, like gravity. Enter Isaac Newton. In addition, the invention of the printing press meant that books that were previously available only to a few could now be mass-produced. Books like the Bible. So people were able to read this text that up to that point was only available to a few who held power, and they were finally able to question the established dogma. They questioned, for example, simple things that they were previously expected to just accept, like whether the rulers who exercised power over them were put in power simply because God said. One such individual was an English philosopher and physician by the name of John Locke, who died in 1704, just a couple of generations before the American Revolution. The alternative ideas about the relationship between the government and the governed would heavily influence the framers of the Constitution in the latter part of the 18th century. His ideas pushed back against this notion that those who are in power have earned their station in life through God's blessing, and those who are subject to their power were so subjected because that was God's plan for them. Of course, those in power would say, "Who are you to question God's plan?" Well, John Locke did question the relationship between the government and the governed. One of the things he proposed was the notion of natural rights, or as some would say, sovereignal organic freedom. Among those rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. Thomas Jefferson obviously changed the wording of that slightly when he penned the Declaration of Independence in 1776. But according to Locke, these are rights that are endowed by all men by their Creator, or God. That's the definition that Thomas Jefferson is operating under, and it's John Locke who provides him the loophole that reconciles the apparent contradiction between Jefferson's definition of liberty as all men being created equal, while clearly not holding the same view toward the African Americans that he held in bondage. In other words, if God endowed men with rights of life, liberty, and property, then what are slaves? Well, property. So if God has endowed men with the right to pursue life, liberty, and property, and slaves are property, then what would Jefferson say is God's position on slavery? Go for it. They're property, and you have the right to pursue property. So folks like Thomas Jefferson have defined natural rights, or sovereign or organic freedom, as simply the freedom to do what one desires, including enslaving other people. It's interesting to note, though, that the very folks who are pushing back against the idea that their rulers were endowed by God are also invoking God to justify the enslavement of others. Furthermore, if one defines citizenship in terms of property ownership, and at least until around the 1830s, property qualifications prevented many, including non-property owning poor whites, from exercising the citizenship rights of voting, then do Thomas Jefferson's slaves count in terms of citizenships and the natural rights that come with them? Well, as many folks would argue during the framing of the Constitution, of course not. If property ownership is what made one a citizen, then black folks couldn't count, because not only did they not own property, but they themselves are property. Now, it's true that not all black folks in that era were slaves, but by that time in American history, blackness and slavery were practically synonymous. I actually addressed that in more detail in a previous episode, so if you're interested, hit the link below. So we can see that based on this definition of freedom, Thomas Jefferson was able to make his assertions that all men are created equal with a straight face, notwithstanding folks like Thomas Paine, who did call him out on it. Contrast that with the notion of sovereign or organic freedom with the way in which African Americans have typically constructed freedom. The experience of African Americans from the inception of this country to the present has concerned itself largely with the notion of collective freedom, or what some people refer to as collective deliverance. Collective deliverance is understood as the liberation of a group from external control or captivity, be it slavery or oppression. Collective deliverance pursues a more universal definition of freedom that seeks to expand freedom to the broadest extent possible, not just to those who manage to purchase their freedom, not just to those who happen to live in the North, but amongst all people throughout the land. That is a universal freedom as opposed to an individual freedom that the framers envisioned. That is the reason why Harriet Tubman, who gained freedom by escaping to the North, continued to go back to the South, risking her own freedom 19 times, escorting over 300 slaves to freedom via the Underground Railroad. It's also the reason why folks like Denmark Vesey, a free black man in South Carolina, led a slave revolt in 1822. One of the ways in which this clash between sovereign or organic freedom and collective deliverance continue to collide with one another is manifest in the ongoing crisis, the water crisis, in Flint, Michigan. In April of 2014, an unelected body switched the source of Flint's drinking water from the Detroit River to the corrosive Flint River. In this instance, an unelected emergency manager appointed by Governor Rick Snyder imposed his will on the residents of Flint, Michigan, while the people of Flint, subject to that power, sought the collective freedom to manage their own affairs, including the source of their drinking water. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the crisis in Flint, Michigan, I've provided a link below to a series of in-depth articles that gives great coverage to the issue, and I would encourage you to check it out. What are some of the other ways in contemporary society in which the notion of sovereign or organic freedom and collective deliverance continue to be at odds? I look forward to seeing your discussion in the comments below. That does it for this episode. If you'd like to see more content like this, please hit the like button below. YouTube's search algorithms are increasingly relying on likes and comments, so liking the content you want to see more of will help that content propagate. I'm Darius Spearman. Thank you for watching.